Cameras once flashed, crowds once roared, and money once flowed through the doors of World Changes Church International like a river that seems impossible to stop. But behind the polished sermons and global influence, something darker was building, something no one inside the ministry wanted to admit. And now, after years of whispers, warnings, and undeniable cracks forming in the foundation, the fall of Creflo Dollar's empire is no longer a rumor. It is a collapse unfolding in real time. What you are about to hear is a truth that many connected to WCCI hoped would never be spoken aloud. For decades, World Changes Church International stood as one of the most recognizable names in American megachurch culture. To many, it looked untouchable. A glittering sanctuary, millions in global partnerships, television broadcasts reaching every corner of the world, and a pastor whose name had become synonymous with prosperity itself. But as we pull back the curtain today, you will see a very different story. A story that insiders whispered about, former members hinted at, and critics tried to expose long before the public began to notice the smoke rising from inside the ministry. You're about to hear how a church that once promised hope, abundance, and transformation became the center of financial scrutiny, declining membership, leadership struggles, and internal fractures that no one expected to become this visible. You won't believe the hidden pressure points that were quietly destroying the ministry from within, and the shocking turning points that finally pushed WCCI to the edge. Because the truth is, this collapse didn't happen overnight. It was years in the making. It grew quietly, disguised under polished sermons, packed conferences, and the image of success. But as you'll soon discover, this is where the story begins to take a turn no one saw coming. Before the collapse, before the controversy, before the world began questioning what really happened behind the doors of World Changers Church International, there was a moment when Creflo Dollar looked unstoppable. In the late 80s and throughout the 90s, he wasn't just building a church. He was creating an empire, one that blended spiritual authority with corporate polish, transforming WCCI into a powerhouse that millions admired and millions more feared to question. Back then, people spoke about Creflo Dollar the same way others spoke about major cultural figures. His sermons dominated television networks. His conferences were packed wall to wall. Families traveled across states just to experience the electric atmosphere inside the sanctuary. Every Sunday felt like a production. Every message felt crafted to elevate the brand, and every new building project felt like proof that God's favor was tied directly to expansion. But there was something else happening behind the scenes, something many early members now say was the first red flag. As the ministry grew, so did the expectations placed on the congregation. Giving wasn't just encouraged, it became a culture, a measurement, an unspoken requirement. The more the empire expanded, the more the message leaned toward financial obedience, sowing into leadership, and believing that wealth was not just a blessing, but a spiritual responsibility. At first, it didn't seem alarming. People were excited. People believed the vision felt bigger than life. But growth at that scale is never simple, and every empire that shines brightest also casts the darkest shadow. Even in the early days, a few former staff members recall moments when cracks appeared behind the polished image, cracks no one dared talk about publicly. Because the truth was this: the bigger WCCI became, the more pressure sat beneath the surface. Pressure that would eventually encourage decisions, behaviors, and financial practices that never fully added up. Pressure that turned a ministry into a machine that required constant feeding. Pressure that would one day play a major role in its downfall. And this is where the story shifts, because while the rise was impressive, what came next exposed a very different side of the ministry, a side no one expected to see so clearly. But what happened next changed everything forever. The early 2000s brought a turning point that many inside WCCI remember vividly. The ministry was still growing, still shining, still projecting the image of unstoppable momentum, but beneath the surface, a quiet unrest had begun to rise. It started small, with murmurs from longtime members, odd financial decisions that didn't make sense, and concerns that were brushed off as attacks from the enemy. Yet each unanswered question grew louder, and each uncomfortable moment added weight to a foundation already starting to shift. For years, Creflo Dollar had preached a message centered on prosperity, abundance, and the power of financial faith. It wasn't unusual. Many large ministries use similar language, but what set WCCI apart was the scale, the expectation, the intensity with which giving was emphasized. Former members described moments when offerings felt less like worship and more like pressure, when monthly campaigns focused on goals rather than needs, and when the promise of material blessing overshadowed the deeper spiritual message people originally came for. Then came one of the ministry's most controversial moments, a moment that would follow Creflo Dollar for years, the push to acquire a luxury aircraft for ministry travel. To some supporters, this seemed reasonable for a global leader, but to critics, the optics were damaging. Suddenly, headlines questioned priorities, detractors accused the ministry of extravagance. People who had quietly wondered about financial stewardship now spoke out more boldly inside the church. You could feel the tension shift. Leaders defended the decision, insisting it was for the gospel. Members who questioned it were often told they lacked faith or misunderstood the vision. But the damage had already begun. The outside world was watching with narrowed eyes, and the inside was filled with people asking themselves a question they were afraid to say out loud. What exactly is happening to World Changers Church? This moment wasn't the collapse, but it was the first major crack that exposed how fragile the image of invincibility had become. Because once people begin to question the direction of a ministry, they also begin to notice everything else they had ignored for years. Attendance patterns shifted, financial commitments fluctuated, some longtime members quietly stepped away, and with every exit, the once thriving community felt just a little less unified, a little less unstoppable, and a little more vulnerable. But the real unraveling was still ahead, because what happened next wasn't triggered by money, image, or controversy alone. It came from inside the leadership itself, and when it hit, it shook the entire ministry in a way no one saw coming. As the public controversies grew louder, something far more dangerous was happening behind closed doors. For years, WCCI operated like a finely polished machine with a hierarchy that appeared unified, loyal, and deeply committed to the vision. But former staff members later revealed that the inside of the ministry was nothing like the calm spiritual order projected on stage. Instead, it was filled with tension, fear, and an internal pressure that only intensified as cracks in the public image began to widen. Insiders recall moments when leadership meetings felt less like spiritual planning and more like damage control. Decisions were no longer rooted in community growth or spiritual impact. They were often shaped by optics, finances, and the need to maintain a public image that was already starting to fade. And when leaders operate from fear instead of clarity, instability becomes inevitable. But what truly shook the foundation was the growing divide between Creflo Dollar's inner circle and the rest of the ministry team. According to those who observed it closely, conversations shifted from how do we help people to how do we protect the brand. Staff members who asked questions were quietly sidelined, some were transferred, silenced, or simply replaced. Others walked away on their own, feeling the environment had become more corporate than spiritual. Still, the silence from inside WCCI spoke louder than any public sermon ever could. Former employees described a culture where speaking up felt dangerous, where transparency was rare, and where loyalty was expected even when things didn't make sense. This atmosphere created a new kind of pressure on Creflo Dollar. Pressure to maintain control, to maintain relevance, and to maintain financial strength, even as the foundation shook beneath his feet. Tensions escalated when several long-respected leaders reportedly departed, some quietly, some abruptly. These were not minor roles. These were individuals who had shaped the church's structure for years, people with influence, people with insight. Their exits sent shockwaves through the congregation, raising questions no one on stage was willing to answer. And then came the moment no one expected. A leaked internal message circulated only among select leaders hinted at financial strain, declining membership, and long-term sustainability challenges. While it never reached the wider public, it spread quickly throughout the inner staff. For many who saw it, the truth was undeniable. WCCI was no longer what it used to be. Its growth had slowed, its influence had weakened, and its internal unity had fractured. This was the moment when loyal members began to feel something shifting. They couldn't explain it, but they felt it. An atmosphere that no longer radiated confidence or stability. Even the sermons changed. The energy on stage felt different. The old, once magnetic presence of Creflo Dollar appeared heavier, more guarded, and less certain. Members